G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we've got another Coach's Corner video. We're going to try to start doing more of these. We've got some positive feedback from the first couple. This one today is going to be on Vinh-Khang, one of my online clients. He's been working with me since December of 2020. Now we're here in August, about 7-8 months later. And he's made some really solid progress in that time. So we're going to discuss what we've done that's worked, what we've done that hasn't worked, and some things we've changed, what we're currently focusing on in terms of technique as well as programming. And then probably a bit even more interesting than that will be just some overall considerations in regards to real life applications of the program to the lifter and how we can have this idea of what's going to be optimal, but how that doesn't always go to plan and why that is okay. So in front of you here, we have the program we're currently running. So we're trying to take things a little bit heavier with Vin squat and deadlift. Bench is currently a bit lighter due to a shoulder issue that we're currently recovering from. So nothing's going too crazy when it comes to bench. But with squats, we are starting to go a bit lower in reps. So for a long time with squats, we stayed at sets of 6, and this continued to work for a long time. And we saw some great progress. But we're going to discuss a bit later on why we've changed to 4 reps and why it was able to work for so long. But we'll get into that later. First off, we're just going to run through the current program. So we have comp squat, first week 2 sets, and then from the third week onwards, we're going to have 3 sets, RPE 6, 7, and then next week it'll be RPE 6, 7, 8. Close grip, pause bench. We previously ran 4 days a week benching. We're currently only doing 2 days a week, both fairly low in terms of intensity, just due to a shoulder issue that we've been dealing with. And then here we have our first deadlift session. So we have sumo deadlifts, 4 total sets of 2 reps. So we have a bit of a cluster set up here. Vin's doing 2 reps, but each of these reps is going to be done as a single. So he's going to do 1 rep, stop, reset, and then do the second rep. In this instance here, I have a target weight of 245, and then that's going up by 5 kilos RPE. 5 kilos each week, just to give him a rough guide of where to be working at. But I've also have a guide of RPE 5 to 6. I more care about it being an RPE 5 to 6. So if 245 was too light or too heavy, I'm happy for him to change loads to allow this to be the case. But I'm still giving a little bit of guidance about roughly what weight he should be working at. Mainly so we can purposely keep these lower. Because if I didn't, I expected that he would start to go quite a bit heavier on these than I'd like, and then they'd start to lose their purpose of being some easier deadlifts. And then, honestly, mainly for a bit of fun, on the last set here, we have a AMRAP at 9. So he's doing some pretty easy doubles, 3 sets. And the final set, I'm just gonna let him go for an AMRAP and see how many reps he can do. Honestly, as I said, purely for fun. And that's something important to, when it comes to programming, it's not always about what's most optimal. It's also important for the lifter to enjoy what they're doing. And if that's gonna make this deadlift session a bit more interesting for Vin and allow him to have a bit more fun, then that's definitely something we want to take into consideration. So this second day is Vin's more accessory-based day. We've found that with his schedule, having 2 to 3 main lifts on most days and then not having many lifts after that has been a good approach, because he's struggled time-wise and just energy-wise to do 2 hard main lifts and then do many accessories after. So instead, we have 1 day with heaps of accessories. If he struggles to get this day in, I've just asked him to try split these up on other days just to allow these to get in. But these, in the context of his powerlifting program, are some of the lower priority exercises. So we've got machine shoulder press, SSB split squat, pec deck, rounded back extensions, and straight arm lat pull down. So more of a bodybuilding day here. Some higher rep stuff, some higher RPEs as well. Day 3, we have his main sumo deadlift day. So here we are running with top sets of 2 at RPE 8 and then back off sets of 8. In the first week, we're doing sets of 8. We're doing 2 back off sets of 8. And then as of the second week, we're doing 3 back off sets of 8. I've experimented in this current block with putting these back off sets a fair bit higher. So usually with people doing this many reps rather, we wouldn't be using such a high percentage, but Vin is really good at doing reps, and that's something we'll get into a bit later. And that's why when we use percentages or whatever programming kind of approach we use, we need to make sure we're tailoring it to the individual. If I gave Vin 70, 72%, he'd be using weights that are simply too easy. He'd be using weights he could do for maybe 15 reps, and it just would be a waste of time when it comes to trying to get stronger. So we're gonna experiment with this 80% back-offs of PDM. So you can see here, I don't think Vin's done this session yet, but he's just penciled in that he wants to do 280 for 2 at RP8. Maybe he has done this, but I don't think he has. He probably would have posted it online and I would have seen it because that'd be an all-time PB. So maybe this is him just kind of giving himself a target weight to work towards. And then from there, he's going to be doing 252 for 8s, which is very reasonable for him. It's definitely something within his abilities based off sets he's done before. 2 count pause bench, 2 sets of 7. So another fairly kind of stock standard higher rep day, just trying to keep the load low as we manage that shoulder issue that he's been going with. And then finally, we have the B stance 2 dumbbell RDLs. We'll explain in a bit more detail why we've gone with this variation a bit further down the track. Now, final day, we have 2 squatting variations, high bar squat and hack squat. I won't get too much into these right now, but there is some specific reasons and some important things we can discuss when it comes to this day. Once again, in the first week, we have a less number of sets as a bit of an intro week / deload. And then as of week 3 onwards, we increase the number of sets. So scrolling back to the top, we'll just have a little bit of a chat about Vin's experience so far and just some things we can be aware of. So Vin came to me having a 210 for 1 wrap squat, 135 kilo bench, and a 270 for 1 deadlift. I'm pretty sure that was done on bumpers, just to make note of. He's since been able to do 210 for 5 in sleeves. Just the other day, he did an unprogrammed 240 squat in wraps. That was just as a kind of fun thing that he threw in at the end of a training block. Wasn't really planned. We weren't doing singles in the lead up. So for him to do that just out of nowhere, I don't think a 250, 260 squat in wraps is far off at all. Bench, we haven't been able to hit any all-time PBs, mainly because of some shoulder issues that we've been dealing with, but he has been able to do 110 to 115 for sets of 8 to 10. So we definitely are building a solid base up there to push his bench into the 140s and beyond. And then with the deadlift, he's done 270 for 4 with really solid technique paused. He did do 270 for 6 unpaused the other week. Technique was a bit sketchy in terms of lockout, so there's a bit of an asterisk on that one. I'm more happy with the 270 for 4 pause. So he's been able to do reps with his old maxes from less than a year ago on both his squats and his deadlift. So some really, really solid progress there. So the first thing we can probably talk about when it comes to Vin's training is minimum effective dose. Vin doesn't train that much. He came to me struggling to do more than 2 sets on the main lifts. If he'd do sometimes even 1 hard set, and the other sets he were doing were so easy they wouldn't even kind of be considered a hard set. We have these ideas of like volume landmarks and I need to be doing this many sets per week and different targets and different guidelines to go by. But what it really comes down to is the individual and where they're currently at. If someone is doing 10 hard sets of deadlifts per week, 10 hard sets of squats, 15, 20 hard sets of bench, this will form our baseline of where we're at with volume, and that will kind of heavily influence what we do with our volume, whether we go up or whether we go down. When Vin came to me, he was doing very little overall hard sets. So my goal was to allow him to do a little bit more volume, but at the same time, he's been able to make really good progress without having to do that many sets. So I'm a big proponent, we're all big proponents of, not doing endless amounts of work that we don't really need. And probably what really matters with that as well is don't fix what isn't broken. We've been able to make some really good progress, not doing that many sets. Would 3 sets consistently be better with deadlifts? Maybe, but he's making progress. So I'm happy on that front. I'm happy. I think Vin's happy with his progress. So that's really something to be aware of. Yes, other people may have to do X, Y, Z to make progress, but our best indication of if what we're doing is working is the data we collect from our training. If we're making progress in the way we want to with our training, we probably don't need to be thinking too hard about anything else. So the next thing we can probably discuss is just some Vin's schedule and how that has made it tricky at some times to push and how we've gone about that. So Vin sometimes has a big work and study schedule. So there's some weeks where he feels really recovered and is able to push hard, and some weeks not so much. So something we can kind of look at here is trying to make hay when the sun's shine. Vin's really good at this, and he knows when there's weeks where he has more recovery resources up his sleeve, when he's feeling better, less stress from work, more sleep, he pushes it. And he knows if there's weeks where he just doesn't have it in him to be at his maximum, he pulls back, whether that's sets, whether that's load, he just doesn't do as much to account for that. And this is something that's really important. Everyone has ups and downs with their weeks. Everyone has certain weeks where they're going to be in a position to push really hard, and other weeks they're not. So we want to make hay when the sun shines. If everything's lined up, if we've got a lot of recovery resources, we have more time, push your training hard. Take advantage of it so that when those weeks come where you just don't have the ability to push as hard, we can pull back a bit. Something else that we can discuss with Vin's program over time is that it hasn't really changed a lot. And this is because, once again, what we've done has worked. Vin started off about 180 for 6 at the end of his first block with squats and was able to go all the way to 210 for 5. And he would have been able to do a 6 rep. He just didn't do the 6 rep. So up 30 kilos essentially. So why would we change the approach? Like, what we were doing was working, so we kept pushing it block after block. And this is something I do with a lot of lifters. If I see that the momentum is there for them to continue to make progress, I don't change anything, because why would we? If we're making progress, keep at it. Something else we can discuss here is how to go about that. So to be able to put 30 kilos on your sets of 5 to 6 for squats in a year definitely takes some hard work. There's no denying that. Vin has put a lot of hard work into his training. But something else that I think is really important to mention here is that we need to have the belief that we can do hard things and we can make progress. If Vin got caught up in these thoughts of, now I'm going to plateau after 2 blocks, I think I'm reaching a bit of a limit, straight away he would have written himself off for making more progress. But he has the belief in himself, and I had the belief of him that he could continue to make progress. And what do you know? He was able to. So a couple more things we can discuss just from the overall picture with Vin as a lifter. And that would be prioritizing both technical efficiency as well as muscle growth. So particularly with his deadlift, Vin has a really efficient sumo deadlift, a very short range of motion, very wide stance, especially with the deadlift bar. He's able to get out quite wide. It's a pretty low range of motion exercise. And he has a lot of success with this. He's able to lift all the weight on the sumo. And because the nature of the way he goes about his deadlift is quite technical, we spend a fair amount of time and continue to tinkering at his technique, trying to continue to refine and make his sumo deadlift as efficient as we can. So we are doing things down the kind of efficiency, short range of motion, specificity end. But at the same time, we're also doing work on the other end of the spectrum. Vin has exercises in his program that are more geared towards hypertrophy. So for a long time, we used stiff leg deadlifts as a kind of anti-sumo deadlift. He was even doing these off a deficit at some stage to account for the fact that he has pretty long arms and good leverages. And he was able to do some solid work here to give his posterior chain a bit more of an overall hypertrophic stimulus, as well as just a bit more of a strength stimulus. Because when we're doing really short range of motion sumos, there's a limit with how much kind of pure strength we can build. So we had those stiff leg deadlifts in there to make sure he was still getting some solid work in, just to build up his posterior chain. And he was able to take those from, I think, starting about 150 for sets of 8 up to about 180 for sets of 8. So he really did a lot of solid work in there to just build up some general posterior strength, posterior chain strength. So it's important to remember that, yes, if we have these really hyper-specific short range of motion powerlifting techniques, we want to refine our technique. We want to make things efficient. That will help us lift more weight. But over the long term, what will also help us lift more weight is just generally getting stronger and generally building muscle. And how are we going to do that? Probably got to go over to some exercises that have a bit more of a range of motion, allow us to work more muscle over a greater range, just build more strength. Okay, let's have a look here. Before we get into the 3 lifts one by one, the last thing we can probably discuss here is just kind of lifter intuition or feedback. Vin gives me fairly thorough feedback on a weekly or fortnightly basis as to how he's feeling, what he thinks has been working, what he thinks hasn't been working. And there's been some things that he's kind of figured out when it comes to technique over the course of this time that we've been able to take on board. He might have an idea about a way to go about his deadlifts, a small tweak to make. The same thing has happened with bench and squats as well. Just little things that are going through his mind, little things that you're trying to focus on. And this is something that's really important, especially with someone who is fairly advanced into their training, lifting at a fairly high level. He spends a lot of time thinking about how to become better at training. So obviously I'm giving him a lot of things to focus on. I'm giving him things to prioritize, little tweaks to make. But he's also helping that conversation. It's kind of a team effort. We're both working together to make him become the best lifter he can. It's not just a case of him saying, yes, Didier, I'll do this. He's contributing to the conversation as well. Some things he's said, I've thought, yeah, maybe not so good. But for the most part, there's been some really solid things that have come from it. So now we'll start to kind of break it down lift by lift. So we can pull up a video of some of the squats that Vin has hit. So here we have Vin hitting one of his best sets of squats. This was, I believe, 200 for a set of 5. He did end up doing 210 for 5. I'm going to pop that in as well. But this would be quite up there when it comes to his squatting strength. One of the best efforts he had. As we watch through this, done at a reasonable RPE, a little bit left in the tank here, but there's probably a few things we can try emphasize a bit technique-wise. So as the set goes on, we're noticing a little bit of wobbliness with the bar on his back, so we could probably do a bit better effort of trying to really pull the bar into his back to make it nice and tight. And then other than that, probably just trying to be a little bit slower on his descent just to keep his brace nice and strong. Probably rushed a little bit too much and lost some of that stacked position that we like to maintain. So that's something that he could do a better job of here. So here we have with the biggest sleeve squat that Vin was ever able to do. This was after doing 210 for 5. He wanted to just give 220 a spin. And you'll see he did it quite easily. This is very well executed. Couple things we can note of here. In my mind, this was no more than like an RPE 6 probably. Vin did feel like this was a lot harder than it actually was. And that's been a kind of common theme across his lifting experience. There's been a lot of times where I've been kind of encouraging or coaxing him into realizing that there's more that he's capable of than he actually thinks. And I think so in the last couple of months, he's realized that, and he realizes that he's stronger than he thinks he might have actually been, and there's more in the tank than he first thought. And seeing this 220 squat was, I think, a bit of a turning point for him to realize what is in the tank. So here we have a video of him doing 170. This always throws me off because he uses a squat bar. 170 for 170 for 8 rather, on pause high bar squat. So we spoke before about how Vin has been doing stiff leg deadlifts to make sure he's hitting deadlifts not only that are really specific and very efficient with his sumo, he's also doing ones with a longer range of motion just to build more general strength. When Vin first came to me, he said, I don't care too much about being competitive in certain weight classes. I just want to build as much strength I can over the long period. And us having these high bars here is an example of that at work. If we wanted to be the strongest lifter right now, we probably wouldn't do high bars. We'd probably do low bars twice a week, lower rep ranges. But Vin understands that if we can build up a really strong base with these high bar squats, longer range of motion, build some more leg strength, that's going to transfer over to his main squat. And I think that's definitely a big part as to how he's been able to get his squat up so much. We started with these, finishing the first block about 150 kilos, and then we're able to get up to 180 kilos for sets of 8. So that's a heap of leg strength built, which has definitely been able to transfer over to his low bar squat. So the other things we can probably discuss at with squats is we did notice a few things in the 200 kilo low bar set that we could work on technique wise, but for the most part, Vin's a pretty good squatter. There's not too many technical breakdowns. So what do we do when someone is pretty good at technique? We just get them to push hard sets. We don't really need to use many hard variations, any like technique-based variations. We've kept it pretty normal, just a standard low bar squat, and just told them to have at it and just push hard sets. Technique variations can be useful, and they often are useful, but in this instance, it just hasn't been the case. We've just focused on hitting hard sets at high RPEs, trying to progressively overload, and we were able to do that over a long period. The other thing to probably note when it comes to someone with good technique is the focus on muscle building, as I just discussed. because he doesn't need to spend a whole lot of time with these hard tempo or pause variations to improve the skill of his low bar squat, we've utilized that time instead, pushing these more hypertrophy based variations just to build up his base over time. So now as we move to bench, as I mentioned, bench has taken a bit of a backseat for the last few months. We're starting to work it back in now as he has kind of starting to recover from the shoulder issue. He worked with James from Evolve Sports Medicine, and we were advised to first just give bench a break for a second, and then after a period of time, we're able to work it back in just with a lower frequency and with a couple of technique changes that were going to help given Vin's situation. With most people who don't have the biggest bench in the world and who don't have a massive upper body, getting jacked is a priority. So we've used some high rep variations on bench, which helps that, which is a bit more conducive to building muscle. But on top of that, we've had some variations in there that are a bit more catered towards building muscle. And that's something Vin's been able to push in the last couple of months, where doing comp benching hasn't been able to be done to the highest level. So he's been hitting the pec deck hard, he's been hitting incline machine press hard. These have felt fine in his shoulder, so he's just been pushing these hard. Same situation with the squat, just thinking a bit more long term. If we can build bigger pecs, bigger triceps, over time that's going to build us into a bigger human with a larger upper body who's going to be able to bench heavier numbers. So now that his shoulder is starting to kind of come good, we'll probably start to push the intensity a little bit more after this current block and see where things are at. Despite him not being able to hit that big kind of 1 RM PB as he has on squats and deads, we still were able to do some solid work, doing 110 to 115 for sets of 8 to 10. And in my mind, that is definitely a good base for him to build up to be a 140, 145 plus bencher. Once the shoulder starts to come good, we should be able to realize those gains. So finally, we can start to discuss Vin's deadlifts. So had some really good success with his deadlifts. There's been a couple of things we've been focusing on. So right from the start, I was trying to get Vin to have a bit more patience and tension with his sumo deadlift. And it's something we continue to work on. He's definitely got better at it, but it's the battle isn't over there. We still try to focus on that. Initially, he was a bit too tuggy with his deadlift, probably didn't get enough tension through his system, a bit too speedy off the floor. Whereas with the sumo deadlift, we generally like people to try create as much tension through their system and be a bit more patient off the floor so we can set a nice, efficient starting position, which sets us up for a solid lift. So here we have Vin, similar to his 240 squat, going for an unplanned PB attempt at the end of his last block. So let it play. So 275, this was 5 kilos more than he's ever deadlifted. And you can see it looks pretty casual. With that said though, there were some things I wanted him to work on from this single. So I'll let it play again. With this single, the feedback I gave Vin was that he kind of disrespected the weight. He probably just tugged at it and just dropped in and just kind of yanked the bar off the ground, which is impressive that he's able to do that with 275. But when we start to push towards heavier weights, there's gonna be a ceiling on how much weight we can lift if we are a bit too kind of careless with the deadlift. And unsurprisingly, he loaded up 290 next and it didn't break the floor at all. So the things that like we try to focus on with the sumo deadlift is kind of it being a two-part lift. The first part being about setting tension off the floor. So really nailing midfoot pressure, loading our legs up, loading our lats up, and feeling a nice solid brace. We want to hold that shape for a second or even 2 seconds before we start to have the bar breaking the floor. Because if we break the floor without our legs loaded as much as we can, without our lats loaded as much as I can, with our brace a bit sloppy, yeah, we might get it up, but it's very likely that as we push towards higher RPEs, our technique's going to break down and then lockout is going to be compromised. And this is something we saw with some of Vin's deadlifts. As he started to push towards higher RPEs, he would kind of die in the ass really quickly because he would lose his shape. So with our sumo deadlift, especially with this very efficient wide stance, positioning is very, very important. If we can nail positioning and get the bar off the floor with a good position, we'll pretty much be able to pull anything. But if we start to compromise position, we're going to have some problems. So another thing that we've been doing with Vin's deadlifts just recently is the cluster double. So here's an example of Vin doing 240 cluster double. Very happy with how these are looking. As I mentioned before, these are done as 2 singles, even though it's a double. They're kind of done one at a time. A bit of a reset in between. I'll let this play and then I'll explain the reasoning behind this one. So we're seeing a much more patient, well-executed deadlift here, really taking his time to create heaps of tension through his body. So the reason we went with this approach is that we were consistently seeing that Vin's first rep would be hard and then his later reps would get easier, which definitely is what you want, because as we try and push towards heavy 1RMs in comps, in the gym, whatever it is, our first rep is the most important one. We were finding that Vin's was a bit too forward over his center of mass. He was starting a bit too far out in front, and this was making it a lot harder. So these multiple sets of cluster doubles have just given Vin lots of chances to practice holding that midfoot pressure and really finding the perfect spot where his armpit is directly stacked over the bar, just so he has a nice, efficient starting point. And he has reported that he feels better on his first reps, and we have seen that in his training as well. So if we watch here, this is an example of the first rep was hard, but the later reps actually got easier, because if we replay this again, on the first rep, he was a bit too far out in front of himself. So you watch there, armpits a bit in front of the bar, but then on the second rep, tidies up a bit, armpits right over the bar. And we noticed the later reps in this pause deadlift set being a lot easier. So it's definitely something important to focus on with both deadlift variations, armpit directly over the bar. And if we're not nailing that on that first rep, cluster doubles is something that can be useful to help that. We have another set here. Pretty hard first rep, and then straight away, second rep got a lot easier. So once again, example of why we went for the cluster doubles, just to really hammer this home. So the final thing we can discuss with Vin's deadlift is the accessories we use. So I mentioned before that we were using a stiff leg variation, and that we had a lot of success with that. We were able to build up a lot of strength with that. But over time, what ended up happening was that variation was producing a lot of fatigue, mainly through the low back, and this was starting to negatively impact Vin's sumo deadlifts, which is our main priority. Because we wanted to be pushing sumo deadlift strength, at least to some degree, we weren't really going towards a max out, but we did want to build up sumo deadlift strength in a moderate to high rep range. This was a problem. So instead of using a stiff leg deadlift, we were able to use 180 kilos. We opted for B stance RDLs with dumbbells, as well as back extension just loaded with a plate. So people like to kind of really hammer home specificity and why specificity is so important. And they'll take this even to accessories and try and find accessories that really closely similar to or closely mirror the main lifts. There can be some merit to this, but often this is a problem we can run into at certain times, particularly with people who are really, really strong at certain lifts. If Vin wasn't as strong as stiff leg deadlifts or RDLs, this wouldn't be as much of a problem. To give you an example, he was able to do 220 for 8 on RDLs, like just stupidly strong. So this goes from an accessory that's allowing us to build some general strength, build some muscle, to almost becoming a main lift in and of itself. So that's why we moved away from those and have gone for variations that are going to give us that stimulus through the posterior chain with just way less fatigue in the low back when we're using dumbbells for a B stance RDL or when we're using a back extension. This may happen at some stage with the high bar pause squats. He may get so strong at these that these start to create so much fatigue that they negatively impact his main squat, but that's not the case yet. So until then, we'll keep pushing forward as is. Probably one last thing we can mention when it comes to Vin's deadlifts is the higher reps. So on his program here, we have the sets of 8 on day 3, higher than most people would usually use in a strength focused block. One of the reasons we've done this is because Vin just feels that his intuition right from the start has been that higher reps do good things for him. So I definitely took that into consideration. But also, it wasn't purely from his kind of intuition. There is kind of good reasoning to suggest this. People with shorter range of motions lift, sumo deadlifts being a good example of this, tend to do better with lower or higher rep ranges rather, because per rep they're not getting that much volume. So to get an adequate amount of volume, it does make sense to do higher reps. Of course, we want to take this on a lifter by lifter basis and use a reactive approach and see what works and then adjust accordingly. But it makes a lot more sense for someone who's really tall, conventional deadlift, long range of motion to probably do lower reps, because per rep they're doing less work. Whereas with Vin, he's not doing a lot of work per rep because he's simply not moving the bar fast. So this is where we need to individualize the approach. For a lot of people, back off sets of 3 to 5 reps, 4 to 6 reps is probably where they'll be. We can make progress in these higher rep ranges. We don't need to think that anything over 6 reps is hypertrophy or cardio or anything like that. There's times where using higher rep work for deadlifts and for squats as well definitely can be useful for someone looking to get stronger. So that probably wraps the video up. Hopefully you've got a few takeaways as to Vin's experience, what's worked for him, and some things you can implement into your training to make some big progress like Vin has. Obviously, there's been some key points that I've mentioned as to why having a coach to help Vin has been useful, how there's been some decisions that have been made that probably go a bit against the norm that we've been able to make him able to have a lot of success with, and how Vin's been able to push past what he thought he was capable of because he had a coach, because he had someone there kind of believing in him and helping him see what he actually was capable of. So if you are interested in coaching, we're available for coaching both online and in person. Definitely get in contact. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, please chuck us a like, leave a comment down below, and subscribe to our channel. Other than that, happy lifting.